The tabernacle was designed as a type or a metaphor for the nation Israel. According to Hebrews 9:9, the tabernacle was a parable for the then present time. Dodds, in his commentary 1980, page 331, says, New Testament usage, and especially the usage of this epistle, indicates that the present time must refer to the Old Testament period. This means that the tabernacle was a form of revelation. Remember that even if the average Israelite could read, he or she would not have access to a written copy of God's law. Yet it was vital for the Israelites to understand the message embodied in the law. The tabernacle was one medium through which God communicated this knowledge. It illustrated a clear message concerning the holiness of God, the need of the individual and nation because of sin, and God's willingness and ability to meet that need. In chapter 9, the author compares the Old and the New Covenant and the patterns of worship that arise from those two covenants. It's a very simple arrangement in chapter 9 where the writer talks, first of all, about the revelatory arrangement of the tabernacle, the Old Testament tabernacle, the necessity of entering and worshiping by blood, and then what was accomplished through the worship of the old tabernacle. He then goes on and he talks about those three things in relation to the new covenant and the tabernacle in heaven. So in verses 1 to 6, he talks about the revelatory arrangement. Now, even the first covenant had regulations of divine worship and earthly sanctuary. For there was a tabernacle prepared, the outer one, in which were the lampstand and the table and the sacred bread. This is called the holy place. Behind the second veil there was a tabernacle, which was called the Holy of Holies, having a golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered on all sides in gold, in which was a golden jar holding the manna, Aaron's rod, which budded, and the tables of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. But of these things we cannot now speak in detail. So that's the setting up of the first tabernacle, and we're going to see in a moment that that was a revelatory arrangement. What happened in that tabernacle, the writer begins in verse 6, the priests continually entering the outer tabernacle, performing divine worship. But into the second, only the high priest enters once a year, not without blood, which he offers for himself and for the sins of the people which were committed in ignorance. And then, in verse 8, he talks about what was accomplished through all of this. The Holy Spirit was signifying this, that the way into the holy place was not yet disclosed, while the outer tabernacle is still standing, which is a symbol for the present time. Accordingly, both gifts and sacrifices were offered, which cannot make the worshiper perfect in conscience, since they relate only to food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation or until the new order. So he talks about those three areas. Then he goes on, he talks about the same three areas with regard to the new covenant in verse 11, the revelatory significance. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of good things to come, he entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation. So a divinely ordained and heavenly tabernacle. And then he talks about that he entered through blood, and not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood. He entered the holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. And so now, two very important distinctions have been made. Christ served at the heavenly tabernacle, and Christ came by blood, not the blood of bulls and calves, but his own blood, and he only had to come once in order to obtain eternal redemption. And then he goes on in verse 13 and he talks about the accomplishments. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling those who had been defiled sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And so the accomplishments are a total cleansing, a fitting of the individual for the presence of God, the removal of guilt before God. And then, of course, in verses 15 through the end of the chapter, there's a conclusion. And in the conclusion, he basically does two things. He talks about the fact that Christ's death frees those who are called from the sins identified by the first covenant. So the first covenant clearly identified the sinfulness of the nation and the individual, and Christ's death frees from that. And then secondly, he talks about the fact that both covenants, and he uses the image of a will. A will is not inaugurated. It cannot be read. Its provisions cannot be enacted until the death of the person who wrote the will. And so he says this is true with the Old Covenant, and it's true with the New Covenant. The New Covenant, everything in the Old Covenant was enacted or brought to bear with death, the death of a substitute, of a lamb or of a pigeon or whatever was required by the law. And he says the same is true with Christ. The promises existed for a long time, all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy was the first harbinger of promise. But those promises could never be enacted. They could never be brought to bear upon the lives of the people of God until there was a death. And what our writer is saying then is that the death of Christ inaugurated the new covenant and made the realization of its promises possible. Now, we're going to talk about this in detail, but this is just the big picture of this chapter 9. Let's think about some of the detail. In 9, 1-5, the writer unpacks the arrangement of the various articles within the tabernacle. Cockrell discusses why the author places the altar of incense in the holiest of holies. Be sure to check out what he says. I'm not going to talk about it here. I think he's correct in his assessment. You'll notice that the way the writer describes the tabernacle, he envisions the people moving about and the Levites repeatedly setting up the tabernacle. So at every stop, the Levites were responsible to set up things according to the pattern given to them by Moses, and worship was also to follow the Mosaic instructions, under which only one person was ever permitted to enter the holiest of holies, the place God manifested his presence in glory. Verse 8 then points out that these structures and rituals were a form of divine revelation, showing or making clear that the way by which people could move back into the presence of God had not yet been revealed. That term is translated disclosed in the NIV, but it's a very strong term for revelation. This message was communicated clearly by the elaborate system of barriers comprising the tabernacle structure and ritual. These barriers reminded the worshiper that they were unfit for the presence of God. Verse 8 says the Holy Spirit was speaking through the structure and the ritual of the tabernacle, just as he speaks through all revelation. Every time the tabernacle was arranged according to the divine plan, a message was available to God's people. This is why God stressed that everything had to be done just as he said. If it was not, there was a tampering with the message. Think of the effect this elaborate system of barriers had upon the Old Testament saint. Rather than cleansing the conscience, the sacrifices and rituals that provided ceremonial cleansing actually made the worshiper conscious of sin. In chapter 9, verse 9, the writer tells us exactly what was being communicated by the rituals and the structure of the Old Testament tabernacle. Let me read that again. This is an illustration for the present time. In other words, this was a parable for the worshipers of that day, indicating, this is what it was saying, that the gifts and the sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. These sacrifices were not able to change the essential self-awareness of the individual worshiper. Instead, the very patterns of worship prescribed in the law reinforced the worshiper's consciousness of sin. Hebrews 9:14 may indicate why this was so. The Old Covenant did not provide the means for delivering the worshiper from dead works. The sacrifice could be offered, but it would have to be offered again, and the worshiper knew this. because the sacrifice did not perfect and unrighteousness would continue to invade the worshiper's life. The Old Covenant system of worship reinforced the believer's consciousness of sin. It did not cleanse him or her from it. This is exactly the opposite under the New Covenant. This does not mean that forgiveness was not available or that it was partial during the days of the Old Covenant. As Paul points out in Galatians, promise came before law. Promise was in existence before God revealed his moral requirements for the nation of Israel through the Mosaic Law. That promise was rooted in the character of God. Abraham was justified by faith because God is by nature a forgiving God. When God gave Moses the second set of tablets bearing the law, you remember he broke the first set. God also expounded the meaning of his name, his character. The character of God transcends the law. It gives birth to the law, but it is much greater than the law. This is how God described himself to Moses in Exodus chapter 34, verses 5 through 7. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. He passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the fathers to the third and the fourth generation. Now you notice that the emphasis here is on God's forgiveness and his justice. And both are sovereignly expressed. They are not expressed as a result of requirement. They are expressed and offered on the basis of God's sovereign choice. He can forgive or he can judge. This is his choice. And this is his nature. And he was always like this. And this stands, in a sense, apart from the law. There's a pattern of prayer in the Old Testament that is built around this idea of appealing to the nature of God. I call it the plea. It is a cry for mercy. Most often when it occurs, the Hebrew word kanan is present. It is not an appeal based on the petitioner's integrity or a request based on their faithfulness to the law. It is a plea made when the law condemned. The law has left the worshiper guilty before God. It is an appeal not to law, but to the nature of God. When offered in faith, the petitioner knew God would hear, and then he or she would wait to see if the plea was granted. Moses pled with God when God told him that he could not enter the land. In Deuteronomy 3:23 through 25, we read this, "And at that time I pleaded with the Lord, O sovereign Lord, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven and earth who can do the deeds and mighty works you do? Let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that fine hill country in Lebanon." He pleaded with God, but God said no. Solomon talked about the plea in terms of the normative experience of the people of God as they sought to live for God, but as they failed. In 1 Kings 8:33 to 34, it says this, "When your people Israel, who have been defeated by an enemy because they have sinned against you, and when they turn back to you and confess your name, praying and pleading to you in this temple, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring them back to the land you gave their fathers." Now, in this situation, there was nothing the law could do to remedy the fact that they deserved to be judged by God and sent into captivity. But Solomon says, when they make a plea, I'm asking that you'll listen and grant them forgiveness. That's an appeal to the character of God. David often uses this word. In Psalm 30, in verses 8 through 10, he says, "To you, O Lord, I called. To the Lord I made a plea. What gain is there in my destruction, in my going down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it proclaim your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and be merciful to me, O Lord. Be my help." Again, this is not an appeal to law. The law has condemned. He deserves to die, but he pleads for mercy. And then finally, of course, the most famous of all, Psalm 51, verses 1 and 2, have mercy on me, O God, or I plead with you, O God, according to your love, unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions, wash away my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Again, that is an appeal to the nature of God, and God is a forgiving God. But God didn't have to grant that. And then finally, Daniel, the plea is so strong in Daniel chapter 9. And if you really want to understand this idea of the plea, you must study that passage. I'm just going to break into the context in verse 17. Now, our God, hear the prayers and pleas of your servant. For your sake, O Lord, look with favor on your desolate sanctuary. Give ear, O God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolation of the city that bears your name. We do not make request of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. O Lord, listen. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, hear and act. For your sake, O my God, do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name. What a powerful statement of the nature of the plea. Not only does he plead with God based on his character, but his argument is related to the character of God and the association of the people of God with that character. The issue why God should grant forgiveness is not because they're righteous, but because God's name is at stake, and Daniel is jealous for the name of God. That's another whole subject. But this idea of the plea, all through the Old Testament economy, even though the law made people conscious of sin, even though the law was a system of barriers that made them aware that they were unfit for the presence of God, those who knew God, those who were justified by faith, understood that they could appeal directly to the character of God, because God was a gracious and forgiving and a merciful God. And though there was no warrant for their being forgiven in the law, in his character, he could choose to forgive them. The law wasn't bad. The law was good. It was righteous. It was perfect. The law was a gift. But a part of that gift was that it made the worshiper aware of his or her need for something better, a new age, a new covenant in which access to God would be granted, and in which worship would not constantly reinforce the fact that the person is a sinner, but would rather affirm the fact that they have been perfected. And that is exactly what happens through Christ's inauguration of the new covenant.